Mark always found solace in the woods. It wasn't about the fresh air or the break from the monotony of city life, it was the sense of discovery. Every step off the beaten path felt like a step into a forgotten world. His Saturday morning hike was supposed to be like any other, just a few hours of quiet, surrounded by nature. He packed his essentials, a bottle of water, a map of the trails, his favorite worn-out boots, and a camera for snapping the occasional wildlife sighting. But this hike would be far from ordinary. The forest near Mark's hometown had an eerie reputation. Stories of unexplained disappearances and ghostly sightings had turned the area into a local legend. Mark had always dismissed such tales as superstitions meant to keep children from wandering too far. Still, as he walked deeper into the forest that day, the atmosphere felt different. The usual hum of birds and rustling leaves seemed muted, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. About an hour into his hike, Mark noticed something unusual, a faint trail leading away from the main path. It was overgrown, the kind of path that nature had almost reclaimed, as if urging visitors to turn back. Intrigued, Mark decided to follow it. The trail wound through dense thickets, the branches clawing at his clothes as he pushed forward. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest felt. Time seemed to stretch, and the air grew heavier with each step. Then, he saw it. Hidden behind a cluster of trees, nearly swallowed by vines and moss, stood an old, dilapidated shed. Its wooden planks were warped and weathered, and the roof sagged under decades of decay. Mark paused, his heart pounding in his chest. The shed seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to this world. For a moment, he considered turning back. But curiosity got the better of him. He approached cautiously, the crunch of twigs under his boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Mark pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a groan. The interior was dim, lit only by thin beams of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust motes danced in the air, and the musty smell of damp wood filled his nostrils. At first glance, the shed appeared empty. A few broken tools lay scattered on the floor, and cobwebs clung to every surface. But then his eyes caught something in the corner, a small wooden box, half buried under a pile of debris. Mark hesitated. The box looked out of place, too pristine compared to the shed's dilapidated state. He crouched down and brushed away the dirt and leaves. The box was locked, but the lock was rusted and fragile. With a bit of effort, Mark managed to snap it open. Inside, he found a stack of photographs tied together with a faded ribbon, a weathered journal, and, to his shock, a small, rusted revolver. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The photographs were black and white, their edges frayed with age. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from just outside the shed. Mark's heart raced as he spun around, his eyes scanning the forest. Nothing. Just the same oppressive silence, the trees standing like silent sentinels. He backed away slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to stick around to find out. As he hurried back to the main trail, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had unearthed something that was meant to stay hidden. The shed, the photographs, the diary, they were more than relics of the past. They were a warning, a testament to a mystery that was far from over. And though he didn't know it yet, Mark's discovery would set off a chain of events that would change his life, and his town, forever. Mark sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, the artifacts from the shed spread out across his coffee table. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and unease. The forest had always been a refuge for him, a place where the weight of his everyday life, grading papers, navigating strained friendships, and the gnawing loneliness, could be momentarily lifted. But now, it felt as though the forest had chosen him for something far heavier, something he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. He stared at the photographs, his finger tracing the faces of the family. Their expressions seemed to shift the longer he looked at them, at first calm, then tinged with unease, and finally, almost pleading. Who were they? Why had they lived in such isolation? The questions gnawed at him, but none of the answers seemed within reach. Mark had always been drawn to stories of the past, particularly local legends. Growing up, he had often heard about the tragic tale of the Harper family, a husband, wife, and 2 children who had vanished nearly 50 years ago. The details were scarce, mostly because the community had chosen to bury the story rather than confront its darker implications. The official account was simple: the Harpers had been reclusive, bordering on paranoid, and had likely succumbed to the harsh realities of wilderness living. But whispered rumors painted a more sinister picture. Some said the family had been hunted by someone, or something, that resented their presence in the woods. Others spoke of the land itself being cursed, driving the family to madness. Mark had always dismissed these tales as small-town gossip, stories spun for dramatic effect. Until now. His curiosity had been ignited by the discovery in the shed, but it was the diary that truly drew him in. The handwriting inside was eerily meticulous, almost obsessive. The entries began innocently enough, detailing the family's move to the woods in 1973. They had sold everything they owned to escape the prying eyes of society, their goal being to live off the land and find peace. The father, Thomas Harper, described building the shed himself, working tirelessly to provide a sanctuary for his family. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Small complaints about the difficulty of farming and the loneliness of their isolation gave way to an underlying fear. "We see them in the trees sometimes," one entry read. "At first, we thought it was just our imaginations, but now even the children speak of shadows that don't belong. Thomas says it's just the wind moving the branches, but I know better. Something is watching us." Mark found himself poring over these words again and again, his chest tightening with each new revelation. It wasn't just the sense of dread that unsettled him, it was the intimacy of the writing. The author's voice, presumably that of Mary Harper, the mother, felt alive, as though she were speaking directly to him across time. Her fear was palpable, and Mark couldn't help but feel her desperation. The next morning, Mark decided he needed answers. He started by visiting the local library, a dusty relic of the town's earlier days that was as much a repository of forgotten stories as it was a place for books. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly librarian, greeted him with a warm smile, though her eyes lit up with curiosity when she noticed the diary in his hand. "Doing some research, Mark?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine interest. "Something like that," he replied, unsure of how much to reveal. "I found this old journal, and it mentions the Harpers. I was wondering if you had anything in the archives about them." Mrs. Jenkins' expression darkened. "The Harpers," she said slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "Not many people ask about them anymore. Most would rather forget." She led Mark to a back room, where stacks of newspapers and documents were stored in unmarked boxes. After a few minutes of searching, she pulled out a yellowed file labeled Harper Family Incident. Inside were clippings from local newspapers, police reports, and even a few handwritten notes from townsfolk who had known the family. Mark read through the articles with growing unease. The reports confirmed much of what he already knew: the family had moved to the woods to escape some unspecified trouble. But there were also disturbing details that hadn't been part of the local folklore. One article mentioned that the Harpers had reported several instances of vandalism on their property, tools gone missing, crops uprooted, even crude symbols painted on their shed. The police had investigated but found no evidence of foul play. What struck Mark most, however, was the abruptness of the story's end. After a certain point, there were no more articles, no follow-ups. It was as if the town had collectively decided to erase the Harpers from memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had ensured the family's story would remain buried. Determined to dig deeper, Mark decided to visit the town's historical society. There, he met Robert, a retired teacher and self-proclaimed historian who had spent decades collecting stories and artifacts from the area. When Mark mentioned the Harpers, Robert's eyes widened. "You're not the first to come asking about them," Robert said, his voice low. "But you might be the first who actually cares about the truth." Robert shared what little he knew, much of it pieced together from rumors and half-forgotten anecdotes. The Harpers, he explained, had been a well-off family before their sudden move to the woods. Thomas Harper had worked for a prominent businessman in town but had abruptly quit under mysterious circumstances. Some said he had uncovered evidence of corruption and had been threatened into silence. Others believed he had simply cracked under the pressure of his job. Whatever the case, the family had severed all ties with the community and retreated to the forest. But even in isolation, they couldn't escape trouble. Robert spoke of strange occurrences in the woods, lights seen at odd hours, whispers that carried on the wind, and sightings of figures lurking just beyond the tree line. It was said that the Harpers had reached out for help once, but their pleas had been ignored. By the time anyone thought to check on them, it was too late. The shed was found abandoned, the family gone without a trace. Mark left the Historical Society with more questions than answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something larger at play, something the town had deliberately kept hidden. The diary, the photographs, and the strange symbols on the shed door, they all pointed to a story that hadn't ended with the Harpers' disappearance. That night, Mark sat at his desk, staring at the documents he had collected. The weight of the mystery pressed down on him, but so did a growing sense of responsibility. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a connection to the Harpers, as if their story was now his to uncover. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The town's reluctance to speak about the family suggested that there were still people who wanted the past to remain buried. But Mark couldn't walk away. He had seen too much, felt too much. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. Frowning, he picked it up and read the message. "Stop digging. Some things are better left alone." Mark's blood ran cold. The message confirmed what he had feared: someone didn't want him to uncover the truth. But instead of scaring him off, it only strengthened his resolve. The Harper's story deserved to be told, and Mark was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Mark couldn't sleep that night. The anonymous message replayed in his mind like a broken record, the words practically pulsing with malice. His small apartment felt suffocating, the shadows on the walls longer and darker than usual. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a growing sense of paranoia creeping over him. Who had sent the message? Was it someone in town? Someone connected to the Harpers? The questions circled endlessly, but the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The next morning, Mark resolved to push forward despite the warning. He wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially one as intriguing and deeply unsettling as this. He packed the diary, the photographs, and a few other artifacts into his bag and set out for the forest once more. This time, however, he wasn't going to the shed, he was headed to an old, forgotten trail marked on the map that Robert at the Historical Society had given him. The trail was rumored to lead to what had once been the Harpers' farmstead, a larger piece of land they had purchased alongside the shed. The farm had been abandoned for years, its existence fading into local obscurity. If there were more clues about what had happened to the family, Mark suspected they would be there. The trek was grueling. The path was overgrown, with tangled roots and dense underbrush making every step a challenge. The forest felt alive in an unnerving way, branches swayed without wind, and the occasional rustle in the bushes made Mark pause, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Still, he pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and morbid curiosity. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Mark arrived at a clearing. In the center stood the remnants of a house, its charred skeleton a stark contrast to the vibrant greenery around it. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The house had been burned to the ground long ago, but the blackened beams and crumbling foundation still told a story. Mark approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the ashy ground. As he explored the ruins, he noticed something peculiar. Among the debris, there were signs that someone had been there recently. A makeshift fire pit sat near the edge of the clearing, its ashes still warm. Nearby, he found empty food wrappers and a tattered blanket. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever had been here wasn't far, and they might not appreciate an uninvited guest. If the Harpers had made their final stand there, it could hold the answers he was looking for. Yet the thought of returning to the shed filled him with dread. He wasn't sure if it was the fear of the unknown or the memory of the strange growl he had heard before, but something about that place felt wrong. Despite his hesitation, Mark knew he couldn't stop now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still too many gaps. He decided to visit Robert again, hoping the historian might have more insight into the symbols and writings he had found in the cellar. When Mark showed him the photographs of the walls, Robert's face turned pale. "I've seen these symbols before," he said, his voice trembling. "They're part of an old legend about the forest. Some say they're warnings, others believe they're part of a ritual. Either way, they're not something you want to mess with." Mark pressed him for more details, but Robert was reluctant to elaborate. "All I'll say is this," he finally admitted. "The forest has a history of making people disappear. Whether it's the land itself or the people who live there, I don't know. But you're playing with fire, Mark. Be careful." The warning only deepened Mark's resolve. He spent the next few days preparing for another trip to the shed, gathering supplies and researching the symbols he had found. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The symbols seemed to be tied to ancient rituals meant to ward off evil, but their presence in the Harper story added another layer of mystery. Had the family used them for protection, or had they been placed there by someone else as a warning? As Mark prepared for his return to the forest, the sense of unease that had been gnawing at him grew stronger. The forest wasn't just a place anymore, it was a character in the story, alive and watching. And Mark couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for him to take the next step. The morning was colder than expected, the kind of chill that seeped into Mark's bones as he parked his car near the edge of the forest. His breath clouded in the crisp air, mingling with the tension that had been building in his chest since his last visit. This time, he wasn't venturing into the unknown on a whim, he was deliberately heading to the shed with the intent of uncovering the Harpers' final stand. The thought of what he might find filled him with equal parts dread and anticipation. Mark had packed carefully. A flashlight with fresh batteries, a sturdy crowbar, a pocketknife, water, and snacks filled his backpack. He had even considered bringing something for protection but dismissed the idea. He wasn't here to fight anyone or anything, just to find answers. Still, the weight of the crowbar in his hand gave him a small sense of security as he entered the forest. The trail to the shed was eerily silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mark tried to focus on his footsteps, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath his boots grounding him. But he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed longer, the trees taller, and every rustle of leaves sounded amplified in the quiet. When the shed finally came into view, Mark froze. It looked the same as before, weathered and decayed, almost as if the forest was trying to swallow it whole. But something was different. The door, which had been ajar on his previous visit, was now closed. Mark's grip on the crowbar tightened as he approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the door and pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was just as he had left it, the dusty floor, the decaying tools, and the faint smell of mildew. But the sense of unease was stronger this time, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Mark stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the floorboards he had pried up before. The hollow space beneath them seemed darker, deeper, as if it were beckoning him. He knelt down and peered into the hole. The hidden compartment was empty now, its contents safely stored back at his apartment. But the map from the cellar had said the Harper's final stand was here, near this shed. There had to be more to find. Mark began tapping on the floorboards, listening for any hollow sounds. After several minutes, he found another loose board near the back corner of the shed. Using the crowbar, he pried it up, revealing a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach churn. Mark hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he had come too far to stop now. The tunnel was just wide enough for him to crawl through, the dirt walls pressing in on either side. Mark moved slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in unpredictable ways. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the sound of his own breathing filled his ears. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger underground chamber. Mark's flashlight revealed a space that looked like a crude living area. There was a cot against one wall, its mattress stained and sagging. A small table sat in the center of the room, covered in papers, jars, and what looked like a hand-drawn map of the forest. But what caught Mark's attention was the wall opposite the cot. It was covered in carvings, symbols etched into the dirt and rock with obsessive precision. Mark approached the wall, his flashlight illuminating the intricate patterns. They were similar to the symbols he had seen in the cellar, but more detailed, more deliberate. Some looked like warnings, others like prayers. In the center of the wall was a phrase carved deeper than the rest: "They are not what they seem." The words sent a chill down Mark's spine. He turned his attention to the table, sifting through the papers. Most were handwritten notes, their contents rambling and disjointed. They spoke of shadows in the trees, whispers in the night, and a growing sense of dread that had consumed the family. One note, however, stood out. It was written in a different hand, neat, precise, and clearly deliberate. It read, "If you are reading this, then you are in danger. They do not want the truth to be known. Leave now, before it's too late." Mark's hands trembled as he set the note down. Danger. The word echoed in his mind, growing louder with each repetition. He had thought he was uncovering a forgotten tragedy, a mystery buried in time. But now, it felt like he was part of the story, a player in a game he didn't understand. As he stepped away from the table, his flashlight caught something in the corner of the room, a small metal box, partially buried in the dirt. Mark crouched down and dug it out, his fingers brushing against the cold, rusted surface. The box was locked, but the latch was weak. With a firm tug, he pried it open. Inside was a collection of photographs, similar to the ones he had found in the shed. But these were different. They showed the Harpers not as a family but as individuals, each photo more unsettling than the last. In one, Thomas Harper stood in the woods, his face gaunt and eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. In another, Mary Harper sat at the table in the underground chamber, her expression blank but her hands clenched tightly around a knife. The final photo was the most disturbing, the two Harper children, standing in front of the shed, their faces turned toward the camera but their eyes were black, void of any humanity. Mark dropped the photos, his breath catching in his throat. He backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. That's when he heard it, a faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. A whisper. It came from the tunnel behind him, growing louder with each passing second. "Go back," it said. "You don't belong here." Mark spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was empty, but the whisper persisted, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Panic surged through him as he scrambled toward the tunnel. He didn't care about the artifacts or the carvings anymore. All he wanted was to get out of that underground chamber and back into the open air. The tunnel felt longer on the way out, the walls closing in as the footsteps grew louder behind him. He crawled as fast as he could, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. When he finally emerged into the shed, he slammed the floorboard back into place and bolted for the door. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Mark didn't stop running until he reached his car. He threw his backpack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Back at his apartment, Mark locked every door and window, his hands still trembling. He tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was his imagination, fueled by the darkness and the eerie atmosphere. Maybe the whispers and footsteps were just echoes carried through the tunnel. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was in that forest, something that didn't want its secrets uncovered. As he sat in his living room, the photographs from the box spread out on the coffee table, his phone buzzed with another message. It was from the same unknown number as before. The message read, "You should have listened." Mark stared at the screen, his blood running cold. The forest had taken hold of him, and it wasn't going to let go. He realized then that the Harper's story wasn't just a mystery to be solved, it was a warning, a testament to the dangers of uncovering truths that were meant to stay buried. But the question remained, was it too late for Mark to escape the forest's grasp? Or had he already become part of its dark history? Mark spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on anything other than the events in the forest. The photographs, the carvings, the whispers, they felt like fragments of a nightmare, yet the tangible evidence scattered across his apartment proved otherwise. He avoided his usual routines, staying home from work and letting his phone go to voicemail. The warning text haunted him, replaying in his mind every time he tried to sleep, "You should have listened." The weight of the experience began to crush him, but Mark knew he couldn't keep the story to himself. Someone had to know the truth, if not for the Harper's sake, then for his own sanity. He decided to return to Robert, the historian at the town's historical society, hoping for guidance or, at the very least, validation. When Mark entered the small office, Robert looked up from his desk, his expression softening into one of concern. "Mark, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, gesturing for him to sit. "What's happened?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he pulled the photographs and the map from his backpack, laying them on the desk. "I went back," he said, his voice trembling. "To the shed. And I found this." Robert examined the items in silence, his brow furrowing as he studied the photographs. When he reached the map, he paled. "This isn't just a map," he said slowly. "It's a record. The XS, they mark locations tied to the Harper's story. This one, Final Stand, that's where you went?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. "There was a tunnel," he said. "It led to a chamber underground. I found carvings, writings, warnings. And, there was something else. I heard whispers, footsteps, but I was alone. At least, I think I was." Robert sat back, rubbing his temples. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. "I've heard rumors about the forest, stories passed down for generations. People disappearing, strange lights, shadows that don't belong. But I never thought there was any truth to it. The Harper's case was always shrouded in mystery, but if what you're saying is true, it's more than just a tragedy. It's a warning." Mark leaned forward, desperate for answers. "What does it mean? Why would someone go to such lengths to hide the truth?" Robert sighed, looking more tired than Mark had ever seen him. "The Harpers weren't the first to vanish in that forest, and they won't be the last. There's something about that place, something ancient, something malevolent. I've heard theories, everything from cursed land to old rituals gone wrong. But whatever it is, it doesn't want to be disturbed." Mark's chest tightened. He thought of the anonymous text messages, the growl he'd heard near the shed, the oppressive silence of the forest. Do you think it's a person? Or something else? Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up one of the photographs and studied it closely. It doesn't matter what it is, he said finally. What matters is that you've drawn its attention. And that's not something to take lightly. Mark left the Historical Society feeling more lost than ever. Robert's words had confirmed his fears but offered no solutions. He spent the next few days in isolation, trying to piece together the fragments of the Harper's story while keeping an eye on his surroundings. The feeling of being watched never left him, and he began to notice strange occurrences, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, faint whispers just beyond his hearing. One night, Mark awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing. He reached for it, his stomach sinking when he saw the notification, another message from the unknown number. This time, it was a single image, a photograph of his apartment building, taken from the street outside. Mark's blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this wasn't just watching him in the forest. It had followed him home. Mark's first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. What could he tell them? That he was being stalked by an ancient force tied to a decades-old disappearance? They'd think he was crazy. Instead, he decided to confide in someone he trusted, Emma, his childhood friend and one of the few people in town who shared his love for local legends. When Mark showed her the photographs and explained everything that had happened, Emma listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "This is serious, Mark," she said when he finished. "You're in way over your head. But if we're going to figure this out, we need more information." Together, they decided to return to the forest, this time with a plan. Emma brought a digital recorder and a thermal camera, tools she had used for ghost hunting as a hobby. Mark felt a pang of guilt for dragging her into the mystery, but her determination gave him a renewed sense of purpose. They would face the forest together. The hike to the shed was uneventful, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emma set up the recorder and camera, documenting the shed and its surroundings while Mark explained what he had found during his previous visits. When they reached the underground chamber, Emma's excitement turned to unease. The carvings and symbols on the walls seemed to unsettle her, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to appear. As they examined the table and the map, the recorder began to pick up faint static. Emma frowned, adjusting the device. "It's interference," she said. "But there's no signal down here. It doesn't make sense." Mark's unease grew. "Let's wrap this up quickly," he said. "I don't want to stay here any longer than we have to." They were about to leave when the thermal camera beeped, indicating movement. Emma froze, staring at the screen. "There's something in the tunnel," she whispered. "It's cold. Really cold." Mark's heart raced as he grabbed the flashlight, aiming it toward the tunnel. The beam illuminated only darkness, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Then they heard it, a faint whisper, growing louder with each passing second. "Go back," it said. "Leave now." Emma grabbed Mark's arm, her face pale. "We need to go," she said. "Now." They scrambled out of the chamber and back into the forest, the whispers following them like an invisible shadow. When they reached the car, they sat in silence, their breaths ragged and their nerves frayed. Mark's phone buzzed again, and he almost didn't want to look. But when he did, his stomach dropped. The message was a video. It showed him and Emma in the underground chamber, their expressions tense as they examined the carvings. But the most chilling part was the figure standing just behind them, a shadowy silhouette with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark, what is that?" "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not human." The drive back to town was silent, both of them too shaken to speak. Mark dropped Emma off at her house and returned to his apartment, his mind racing. The events in the forest had taken a darker turn, and he couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency. The Harper's story wasn't just a mystery, it was a warning, a puzzle with stakes far higher than he had imagined. As Mark sat in his living room, staring at the photographs and recordings, he realized that he couldn't run from the truth. The forest had taken notice of him, and it wasn't going to let him go easily. He had to decide whether to keep digging, risking everything for answers, or walk away and hope that the shadows would leave him in peace. But deep down, Mark knew the truth. The forest had chosen him, just as it had chosen the Harpers. And no matter how far he ran, the darkness would follow. Mark spent the next week in a state of constant vigilance, the shadows of the forest seeming to stretch into every corner of his life. He kept the curtains drawn, his phone on silent, and his doors double-locked. But despite his best efforts to isolate himself, the presence that had followed him from the forest lingered, an invisible weight pressing on his every waking moment. The events in the underground chamber had changed him, he could no longer look at the world as he once had. Something ancient and unknowable had found him, and there was no escaping its grasp. He hadn't spoken to Emma since the night they fled the forest. She had texted him once, a short message that read, "I can't do this anymore. Please don't contact me." Mark didn't blame her. He had dragged her into a nightmare, and she was right to want to distance herself from it. But her absence left him feeling more alone than ever. The recordings they had taken in the chamber still sat on his desk, untouched. He couldn't bring himself to watch the video again, to see the shadowy figure that had stood so close to them. Instead, he focused on the notes and photographs, piecing together the Harper's story with obsessive determination. Every detail felt like a thread leading to a larger tapestry, one he was desperate to unravel, even as it threatened to consume him. The more Mark delved into the Harper's history, the clearer it became that their disappearance was no accident. The symbols in the underground chamber, the warnings carved into the walls, the whispers in the tunnel, they all pointed to something deliberate, a force that had marked the family for reasons he couldn't yet understand. And now, it had marked him. Late one night, as Mark pored over the notes for what felt like the 100th time, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was another message from the unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat or a cryptic warning. It was a single sentence, "Do you want the truth?" Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He typed a response with trembling fingers, "Yes." The reply came almost immediately, "Come to the forest. You know where." He knew it was a trap. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore the message, to walk away and try to rebuild his life. But the pull of the mystery was too strong. The Harper's story had become his own, and he couldn't rest until he knew the truth. He packed his bag, grabbed his flashlight, and drove to the edge of the forest, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. The trail to the shed was as silent as ever, the trees looming like sentinels in the moonlight. Mark's footsteps seemed to echo in the stillness, each step a reminder that he was walking toward something he might not return from. When he reached the shed, the door was ajar, just as it had been on his first visit. But this time, a faint light flickered inside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Mark stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The light came from a single candle on the table, its flame dancing in the drafty air. Next to the candle was a piece of paper, folded neatly. Mark unfolded it, his hands shaking. The message was simple, "Below." He knew what it meant. The tunnel. The underground chamber. Whatever answers he sought, they were waiting for him there. He moved to the corner of the shed and pried up the floorboard, revealing the dark descent. The air was colder than he remembered, the metallic scent stronger. Mark switched on his flashlight and began crawling through the narrow passage, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached the chamber, it was empty. The cot, the table, the carvings, they were all gone, as if the space had been wiped clean. Only the central wall remained, its symbols glowing faintly in the beam of his flashlight. Mark approached it cautiously, his breath shallow. He reached out to touch the carvings, and the moment his fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, and a low hum filled the chamber. The carvings began to glow brighter, their patterns shifting and rearranging themselves. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the room was bathed in an otherworldly light. Then, he heard the voice. "Why have you come?" it asked, the words resonating in his mind rather than his ears. The voice was deep and layered, as if 1,000 voices spoke in unison. Mark's mouth was dry, his body trembling. "I want the truth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to the Harpers? What's in this forest?" The light pulsed, and the voice replied, "The Harpers sought refuge. They fled from the corruption of man, but they entered a domain not meant for them. This forest is older than you can comprehend. It is not a place for mortals." Mark's mind raced, the implications of the words sinking in. "Are you responsible for their disappearance?" he asked. The voice seemed to hesitate. "They disturbed the balance," it said finally. "They sought answers to questions they should not have asked. As you do now." The light grew brighter, and Mark felt a pressure in his chest, as if the air itself was trying to crush him. "What do you want from me?" he managed to say. "You have been marked," the voice said. "Your curiosity binds you to this place. You can leave, but the forest will not forget you." Mark fell to his knees, the weight of the revelation overwhelming him. He thought of the Harpers, of their desperation and fear. They had fled to the forest seeking peace, only to find themselves trapped by forces beyond their understanding. And now, he was part of the same story. The light began to fade, and the pressure in the room lifted. The voice spoke one final time, "Leave, and do not return. The forest will keep its secrets, as it always has." Mark stumbled out of the chamber and back through the tunnel, his flashlight barely illuminating the way. When he emerged into the shed, the candle was gone, and the night was silent once more. He didn't stop to question what had happened, he simply ran, his legs carrying him back to the trail and out of the forest. When he reached his car, he collapsed into the driver's seat, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. He drove home in silence, the weight of the forest's warning pressing heavily on him. Over the next few weeks, Mark tried to return to his normal life, but the experience had changed him. The forest lingered in his mind, its presence a constant shadow. He avoided the trails, the woods, even the thought of hiking. The Harper's story remained unfinished in his mind, but he knew he couldn't dig any deeper. The truth was there, hidden in the forest, but it wasn't meant to be uncovered. Mark's final act was to write down everything he had experienced, documenting the Harper's story and his own encounter in meticulous detail. He didn't know who would read it or if anyone would believe him, but he felt compelled to preserve the truth. When he finished, he locked the notes away and resolved never to speak of the forest again. As the months passed, Mark began to rebuild his life. The whispers faded, and the sense of being watched diminished, but the memories never left him. He often wondered what would happen to the next person who stumbled upon the shed, who ignored the warnings and ventured into the forest's depths. Would they, too, be marked? Or would the forest finally claim its secrets forever? One question lingered in Mark's mind, haunting him in the quiet moments. What happens when the forest decides it's not done with you?